Smalls. I suppose you don't even know who the babe is either. It's plugged. What? Chewing tobacco?
Tobacco, man.
What do you do with it? You're killing me, Smalls.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. It's time for another. It's not really a comic book review. Okay, I'm not going to review every story. I'm just going to give you my general thoughts on most of it. I'll talk about a couple of them more in depth. There's some big hits, a lot of misses in this Green Arrow 80th anniversary comic, in my opinion. I am not the most read up person on Green Arrow, and I think that might be a barrier for entry for a lot of people. If you're not the biggest Green Arrow fan, this might not be the comic book for you, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's supposed to be an 80th anniversary celebration of the character. Should be very inviting for everybody to come on in and check it out. For the most part, DC Comics, other than like, what was the last one I was really disappointed in? Detective Comics 1000, I thought was a big dud. But otherwise, for the most part, they're milestone comics. They're 80th anniversary, and they're like 750 issues for like Wonder Woman and Flash. I think they do a great job. They put really good, solid creative teams together. A lot of creators that have done a lot of important works with the characters, for the most part, are front and center in their books. And then you get some backup stories, and then finally you get a couple of creators that are obviously trying to push in the middle and end. And normally those are like, you know, what does the character mean to you? But you really get some statements about the character from these creators that have been on them a long time. You don't really get that. This is the most like by the numbers, kind of boring version of an anniversary like tribute issue that I've ever seen. They give Mike Grell like 7 pages to do a follow-up to the Longbow Hunters, the greatest Green Lantern story of all times. He's not even the first story in the book. He should be the headliner. Ugh. There is a very, very awesome tribute at the very end from Denny ONeil's son, Larry. And I'm going to talk about that as well. But otherwise, a lot of disappointment. There were some creators I was very excited for. Ramby, not associated with Green Arrow. One of my favorite writers. Not exactly impressed. Ben Percy, associated with Green Arrow. His story's weird. There's no Kevin Smith in here. Who's the other big writer that you would have expected on this book? There's no Andy Diggle. There's some big name creators. Judd Winnick, he's not in here either, that you would have expected to be on this book, that I think would have definitely helped it. And it's full of the creators that obviously DC are trying to push as important, but they have no history with the characters, and I just think for the most part they don't pull it off. The best tributes in this comic book are to his arrows. Like we get an origin story for one of his arrows. That's good. But is that what you come to a Green Arrow 80th anniversary comic for? I want something, you know, mind-blowing about the character. Whether it's a tribute or it's something that maybe an area of the character that was sitting there, it was implied, but maybe you want to fill it in and really give that, you know, that extra oomph to say this is exactly what that meant or something like that. Maybe fill in a blank here or there. None of that really happens. It's just kind of boring, blasé stuff, and then, you know, there's some good art here and there, but I don't know. I came away disappointed, and I'm normally not that way with these milestone issues from DC. And with that said, I hate anthology books, and this is why I hate anthology books. There's not like one main story. Normally, you get like one big story in these, and then a bunch of smaller stories. It's just a bunch of little stories, and nothing with really any impact or meat, in my opinion. Some people are going to disagree with me on the Jeff Lemire, Andrea Sorrentino thing. I'm going to just say it right out. That sucked. And I'll get that to those details here in a minute. So, you know, hey, it's a $10 comic. If you are a Green Arrow fan, you need to buy this. If you don't know a lot about the character, you're not going to find $10 worth of comic in here. I don't think, for the most part. So let's get into the details and look at this comic book and talk about what I think is important. First up, let's talk about this Larry ONeil tribute to his father, Denny ONeil. Illustrated by Jorge Fornes. David Stewart on colors, one of the great colorists in the industry today. It's a silent issue for the most part. The only sounds in here are the sounds of Denny ONeil typing, you know, first on a typewriter and then on a computer as he goes through life. It starts out with him as a little kid watching, you know, or listening to like pulpy stories of the Lone Ranger and other Western characters back when he was a child. Dreaming of being like a writer, perhaps dreaming about these characters as he gets older, And then eventually as he graduates and then he becomes a father, you can see at that point in his life, he's writing Green Arrow. So much love in this comic strip. I think that's what really sets it apart. This probably should have been the main story, even though it's not a Green Arrow story. But this thing was just really touching and very well done. It really chronicles the life and successes and maybe even struggles of Denny O'Neil through his life. It really captures the essence of the man. He's so undervalued for what he's brought to the table. His Batman work is underappreciated. In my opinion, his Green Lantern work is underappreciated. He did so much work on so many important characters, really transformative work that stands the test of time. And I don't think he ever really got the credit that he deserved in life. And I don't even think he really gets it in death, unfortunately. This story from his son, Larry O'Neil, is very touching. As I mentioned, you see him become a father. You see him start winning awards. And he gets older. He's got an entire bookshelf full of awards and all the things that he's done, the acclaim that he's garnered, that he got from the industry. But it doesn't feel like the fan base maybe appreciated as much. And as he's older, and he's still working in comics, you can see he's watching television, and all the talk is about all these superheroes that he's worked on. He's not getting to be a part of that. It's kind of sad. You can see he falls ill later on in his life. And then finally, the very last page, you get this Denny O'Neil, 1939-2020, and all the characters that he worked with at DC Comics that he was so important to. Like I said, he did so much transformative work and really elevated the characters and put his heart and soul into these characters in this line, in creating and developing this wonderful, hope-filled universe. And you can see they're with him on his last days. At least that's how Larry O'Neil saw it. And I thought this was very touching. This is the highlight of the comic, bar none. This is the best moment. If someone else wrote like a 5-star story, I think this still would have stood out as the best moment for me personally, because I really think it captured the essence of Denny O'Neil, what he brought to the industry in a very simple manner in the medium that he appreciated. And I'm glad that Larry O'Neil got to do this. This is a 5-star story all the way through. This is easily the highlight, even though it's not technically about Green Arrow, but 5-star story, 5-star art, perfectly well told, and a great tribute to a very important man in comic book history. Now let's get into the big miss. There's an enormous miss on this. I talked about a little bit in the intro. Mike Grell, possibly, in my opinion, some people would disagree, the greatest Green Arrow writer of all times. If he isn't, he certainly wrote the greatest Green Arrow story of all times, The Longbow Hunters, where we got the character Shadow introduced. Kind of weird afterwards that she ends up, I think she has his half-sister with his father in the New 52, but before that, they're lovers, and she has his daughter, Emiko. Let's not think about that. Let's think about what Mike Grell did on The Longbow Hunters, which is an absolutely fabulous story. If you've never read the Longbow Hunters, go back and read that. It's one of the greatest DC comics ever written. Just one of the greatest comic book stories ever written, in my opinion. Mike Grell brings back Shadow and Green Arrow together once again, but he only gets 7 pages. This should have been the headliner. Mike Grell coming back, revisiting the Longbow Hunters, bringing Shadow back, writing and illustrating, and giving us 20 pages of a headline act for this 80th anniversary tribute. I don't see Mike Grell getting a ton of work within the comic book industry. I imagine that he was more than willing and able to do more than 7 pages. But to put him behind Mariko Tamaki, Tom Taylor, and Stephanie Phillips as the 4th-string writer on a Green Arrow book was insulting, in my opinion. They did not give him near enough time, and this should have been a headlining act. And if he would have gotten 20 pages, this book would be so much better for it. And they could have cut out a couple of the other creators whose stories they added nothing to it. And I'll get to that here in a bit. So this was such a missed opportunity and an enormous disappointment when you get to the Mike Grell story. First of all, that it wasn't headlining, and then that it reads about 2 minutes because it's a lot of action. It's not a lot of words. He needed more time to flesh this out and really show people what he could do with Green Arrow and Shadow still. Very disappointing. Great work on Mike Grell's part. I think he did the best he could with the time that he had, but shame on Ben Abernathy, the group editor behind this book. The editors, Dave Wielgoss and Amadeo Turturro, and the assistant editor, Ben Mears, on this. You completely crap the bed on how you put this book together, what you had headlining on it. Somehow, they do not understand the importance of the creators to this character. And for that reason alone, I do feel like this was probably a failure. Just my opinion. So a lot of people may disagree with me, and they may think that Mariko Tamaki was perfectly fine headlining the book. Funny enough, let's talk about the best stories in here. And we are going to talk about the first two that are in the book, the Mariko Tamaki, Tom Taylor books or stories. And I don't think they're great. I think they're pretty fun. The art from Javier Rodriguez in the very first story, The Disappearing Bandit from Mariko Tamaki, carries the story. It feels like this thing came out of the 40s or the 50s. It's got all that great golden age silliness where you have this villain named the Disappearing Bandit, and it's very campy. It's fun. It feels like it's from that era. I don't think that this isn't anywhere near 5-star or anything, but like that. But it's definitely the best story in here outside of the Denny O'Neil tribute and the Mike Grell work, and that's disappointing. This should have been like the third or fourth best. There should have been a couple of real headliners about Green Arrow. Mike Grell obviously getting more time, and probably Jeff Lemire, but we'll get to that. The next one is Punching Evil. This is the Tom Taylor, Nicola Scott story. It's fun. I don't think when you read this, people are going to come out of it with a greater understanding or appreciation for Green Arrow. That's not what Tom Taylor's going for here. But it's got some interesting moments. It's got Green Arrow sparring and training with Ted Grant, a.k.a. Wildcat, after Dinah, a.k.a. Black Canary, implores him to train him. Some fun stuff in here. He definitely gets his butt kicked. But the big reveal is the origin story for his arrow with the boxing glove. So it's funny. It's got an interesting payoff. But were you really paying $10 for a Green Arrow book with the origin of one of his arrows? Perhaps. But it shouldn't be like one of the headlining stories. This should have been one of the funny anecdotes, kind of like more of an afterthought than one of the shining moments of this story, in my opinion. But it's good. It's interesting. It's certainly entertaining. These are the two best stories outside of the Denny O'Neil tribute and Mike Grell. There's some weird stuff in here that I don't know what they're thinking. There's a story by Devin Grayson, and this is the Speedy Arsenal Roy Harper story. I'm glad that we got one, but this is not what I would have wanted. It's called Green Man and Autumn Sun, and it's basically a tribute to the backstory of Roy Harper being raised within like the Navajo community before Oliver Queen kind of came and adopted him and made him his Robin. Cool stuff. Certainly a lot of potential there. And it's him telling his daughter. Like the story is he's kind of out on a mission, but it's kind of done in the cadence in an homage to traditional Navajo storytelling. That's got a lot of potential, but I don't think it's executed very well here. Roy Harper Arsenal doesn't speak like this. He doesn't speak in this syntax or in this pattern. So it doesn't feel like it's him talking as he's relaying the story of all the trials and tribulations that he's been to up to this point. Obviously, we can see that his daughter Leon is not dead, so that hasn't happened, and he hasn't lost his arm yet. So he's got worse days ahead after this here story. I think if they wanted to do this, it was certainly a good idea. If they wanted to execute it better, it probably would have been more impactful and would have made more sense if he was revisiting his roots with his daughter Leon and visiting the Navajo community that initially raised him, and they were telling the story there, and then it would have made sense within the context of the story. And the worst part is whenever you're being, I don't know, taught, I feel like I'm being talked down to in a book like this, in a comic book, the writer always has to explicitly tell you how you're supposed to come away from the story. And this is what Devin Grayson writes at the very end. Roy Harper's childhood was spent living amongst Navajo people, and this story portrays the impact of his Navajo family on him. The long, grand tradition of storytelling within the Navajo Nation is an enduring tradition, and DC encourages readers to seek out authentic Navajo voices and resources from the Navajo Nation to learn more. Authentic voices like Devin Grayson, apparently. Only by being compassionate, listening even when the experience of others are uncomfortable, and continuing to challenge our understanding of how storytellers affect one another. Can any of us hope to make a meaningful, positive impact on the world we all share? Thank you. Thank you for that disclaimer. That's how you know that you were being talked down to in the comic book, when they have to explain to you how you're supposed to feel when you came out of it. And they certainly do go into the seedier parts of Roy's past when he became a junkie and all that stuff. This story could have been exceptionally impactful and done in a really, really profound way, but they missed the mark by miles, in my opinion. And this disclaimer at the end lets you know exactly how you were supposed to feel about it. I don't like that. That's weak sauce storytelling. Let me feel how I want to feel at the end of the book. That's all I'm saying. The next one that I thought was weird is this Ben Percy story that I was really excited about. Otto Schmidt on art. It's one of the better illustrated stories in here. The Sympathy of the Woods. We get some Emiko, Red Hood in here. And I feel like Ben Percy has another project that pays him a lot more money than what he's doing at Marvel and DC these days, because we're getting a lot of really stupid stories like this. And at one point it's Oliver Queen talking about the woods and how at home he feels there. Kind of makes sense. Ben Percy is always talking about how much he feels at home in the woods. And then he starts talking about how it's like the perfect form of socialism. Look, I get that Oliver Queen, Green Arrow, is a liberal character, but you don't have to spell out the analogy. You can let me decide how I'm supposed to feel about that. It was just really weird. I think Ben Percy is really phoning it in these days. I think he's got another job that pays him a lot more money, and he is not putting in his full effort on his comic books right now. And it was just so strange. Did you know the woods were socialist? The woods were a socialist entity in nature. Ben Percy knew. Like, get out of here with that stuff. Finally, let's talk about the bad stories. And I'm shocked that I put actually all three of these creators. Of the roster of creators on this book that were doing the Green Arrow stories, we'll take the Larry ONeil one out of here. Jeff Lemire, Ram V, Brandon Thomas represented like the upper crust along with Mike Grell. I know a lot of people will throw Tom Taylor in there as well. I don't have quite that much confidence in Tom Taylor yet. I know that he can still crap the bed. And for all three of them, the worst stories, in my opinion, I was shocked. Some people are going to tell me that I'm a moron, and the last Green Arrow story from Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino was moving and remarkable. I say balderdash. It was boring, uninsightful, and as far as being the last Green Arrow story ever, it was quite a letdown. Go read the Green Lantern 80th anniversary special and read that Robert Venditti 4 story. And that's how you say goodbye to a character. Now, I don't think that he should go and exactly like steal that story from him, but man, that's how you do a tribute to a character. This is so weird. The art is fantastic and it's very moody, but he goes to the island. He says he's leaving everything behind. Tell my daughter I love her. And then he constructs a bow and an arrow, makes a fire. He hears something in the woods. He goes to chase it down, realizes he's been going in a circle, and in a younger version of himself gives him an arrow, and he burns himself to death. Mesmerizing. Much worse, in my opinion, was the Ram V story. It's called The Arrow in the Song. If that name is familiar to you, that is because it's a Longfellow poem. Listen, I can go on the internet, and I can find a poem by Longfellow illustrated for free. To put this into a $10 comic book, it says nothing about the character. That poem was not initially written about the Green Arrow character. I don't particularly want poetry in my comic books. It can work here and there as a matter of point, maybe at the end or a conclusion of something, if you wanted to say something profound. There's nothing profound to say in here because Ram V's never written the character. This is the biggest waste of time, and the art by Christopher Mitten absolutely sucks. It's the worst illustrated book in here by far. So if you're going to give me this poem, you better give me some beautiful illustrations, not this dog shit. This comic sucks. This is the worst thing Ram V has ever written, in my opinion. Certainly at the big two. I'm hoping that Ram V did not start huffing his own farts, start believing his own press. A lot of times when creators are on the way up, you get their best work. When they feel like they've made it, they think the editor's off them, the editor being the expectation of the customers, and then they can just do whatever they really wanted to do all along. Hopefully this was just him being really lazy and not having time to write this and putting his name on something that wasn't up to snuff and not a harbinger of things to come. The last one is the Connor Hawke story. I like Jorge Corona. His Middle West series, his illustrations on there with Scotty Young are great. He does not fit in with an action superhero universe, in my opinion. I don't particularly love the illustrations on this, but that is not the real problem. The story by Brandon Thomas, who I think is a really good writer, and I'm excited about his work on DC. I hope he does not write a Connor Hawke series because it's going to suck. This was bad. It took him so long to get into what he wanted to say about actual Connor Hawke. By the time it was ready to happen, it was over because he only had 8 pages. You don't have a lot of real estate in a story like this. One of the reasons I don't like anthologies for the most part. But DC has done a really good job up until now, in my opinion. But this sucked. If you like Connor Hawke, I think you're going to be very disappointed. I don't feel like Brandon Thomas did anything to accentuate or celebrate the character at all. It's just a little mini adventure of him trying not to kill people with his arrow. Interesting. To somebody. Next up, we'll talk about these last 3 stories. There are 3 more. I call these meh. These were neither good nor bad. They were middle of the road. The Stephanie Phillips, Who Watches the Watchtower. We do get to see Hawkman and Green Arrow almost come to blows. It's neither good nor bad. I do love the illustrations from Chris Mooneyham. He's one of my favorite artists. I wish he got more work. The Vita Ayala Happy Anniversary story was a big disappointment. In Wonder Woman 750, she had, without a doubt, the best story on there, and it was miles better than anyone else. It was like a 5-star comic, one of the best stories I read in all of 2020, in my opinion. And this is just so boring and uninteresting. And she got one of the best periods to write, where you could really do some stuff where you have Oliver Queen and Dinah married. You know, it's a different take on their relationship. I don't know. The ending of the story isn't even the end of the story. It's just like you get a third of an adventure. I understand that you're limited by the page count, but you have to adjust your writing style to it. In my opinion, it was a big letdown. But we did get to see Oliver Queen riding bitch on a motorcycle. The last story is Star City Star from Phil Hester and Andy Parks. For the first 4 pages, I thought this was going to be the best story by far, and then they completely crapped the bed on the ending on this one. I still don't even know what happened. Well, I mean, I know what happened, but I don't know why I was supposed to care. It definitely didn't feel like it was doing anything to celebrate Oliver Queen, in my opinion. So those are my takes. The good, the bad, and the ugly of Green Arrow 80th anniversary. The Larry O'Neill tribute to his father, Denny O'Neill, was sublime. I thought it was just perfect. Really encapsulated the career of Denny O'Neill and what he meant to the comic industry. Unfortunately, I don't think enough people are giving him the credit that he deserves. Mike Grell, he did great with the opportunity that he had, but he deserved to be the headliner on this comic book, and he deserved at a minimum 20 pages. Probably should have got 24. They could have cut some of the fat, and this would have been a much better tribute to Green Arrow. It should not have been the fourth story in this. The editorial team on this should probably all be slapped. Also, Mariko Tamaki and Tom Taylor, as far as beyond those two, those are the 2 stories that I would qualify as good. But they weren't exceptional. They really didn't capture the essence of what made Green Arrow, Oliver Queen important. Mariko Tamaki and the artist captured the essence and feel of old school, like 1940s Green Arrow, which was cool. And that was kind of magical, but it didn't really say anything about the character. The Tom Taylor story, we got the origin for one of the trick arrows. That should have been in the back and should have been that real like cherry on top after you got some real celebrations of the character. And that's why I really feel like the editorial team really is the one that dropped the ball. As far as the Masta, I'm not sure what's wrong with Ben Percy right now, but he is not on his A game. The V. Ayala stuff wasn't all that great. The Devin Grayson story probably could have been like that one. Well, it would have been Green Arrow, but at least it could have said something about Roy Harper. And it was a great idea, poorly executed. As far as the bad, I'm shocked Jeff Lemire, Ram V, and Brandon Thomas were the worst of the bunch. If you would have bet me, there's no way I would have ever put my money on those guys being the worst of the bunch. They definitely were, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on Green Arrow 80th anniversary? I imagine most of you liked it more than I did. I think if you're a Green Arrow fan, you're going to like this a lot more than everyone else. But if you're not, very well read on Green Arrow. I think you're going to find, for the most part, this to be very disappointing. It's about as boring and a ho-hum, an anniversary special as you could do. But it was nice seeing Hawkman in an 80th anniversary special. It just sucks that it wasn't his own.